A strict professor put her new student on the spot, expecting him to fail. Instead, she ended up exposing her own bias in front of the entire class. The lecture hall was silent, except for the rhythmic scratching of chalk against the board. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, a veteran professor at Stanford, moved with precision, writing out an intricate calculus equation before turning to face her students. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, pausing just a little longer on the new face sitting near the back. Jamal Richardson. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in her class. Not at this level. At least, that's what she believed. "All right," she said, dusting off her hands. "This one should challenge even my best students." Her gaze lingered on the front row. Students she'd personally mentored. Ones who came from elite prep schools, whose parents donated to the university, whose futures in academia were all but guaranteed. Jamal sat quietly, notebook open, pen tapping against the page in a steady rhythm. Unlike the others, he wasn't frantically writing notes. He just observed. That irritated her. She folded her arms. "Since we have a new addition to the class," she announced, "perhaps Mr. Richardson would like to introduce himself." A few heads turned toward him, some with polite curiosity, others with thinly veiled amusement. Jamal looked up. "I'm Jamal Richardson. I transferred from Howard." That was all he said. No extra details, no attempt to ingratiate himself. Dr. Whitmore forced a tight smile. "Well, I hope you're prepared. This class isn't easy. I assume you have the prerequisite coursework?" "I do." His voice was even, unwavering. "Good." She turned back to the board, but something about his confidence unsettled her. She decided to push further. "Since you're here, let's see where you stand." She tapped the equation on the board. "Can you tell me the first step to solving this?" A murmur rippled through the students. First-day challenges weren't unheard of, but they were usually reserved for students she had doubts about. Everyone understood the implication. Jamal, however, didn't flinch. He leaned forward, studied the problem for a moment, then spoke. "You'd start with a partial fraction decomposition," he said smoothly. "But given the structure, a Laplace transform would be more efficient." The room fell silent. Dr. Whitmore's fingers curled slightly. That was correct. Not just correct, insightful. Most students would fumble through a basic decomposition. He skipped straight to an advanced method without hesitation. Still, she wouldn't be thrown off that easily. "An unconventional approach," she said carefully. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll see if your methods hold up under pressure." She turned back to the board, but the damage had been done. The class had noticed. Some students exchanged glances. A few whispered under their breath. She needed to reassert control. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's move on." But as she continued the lecture, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. This wasn't over. But Jamal knew it too. And he was ready. Dr. Whitmore moved on, but her mind was still on Jamal. His answer had been too quick, too precise. She had seen students like him before, the ones who came in thinking they were special, thinking they could shake the foundation of her class. Not this time. She scanned the room as she continued the lecture, her eyes flicking back to him every so often. Jamal sat with the same quiet confidence, pen tapping lightly against his notebook. He wasn't showing off, wasn't smug, wasn't even trying to prove anything. That bothered her more than it should have. She adjusted her glasses and turned toward the class. "All right, let's see if you've been paying attention. Who can tell me the significance of this transformation in real-world applications?" Hands shot up, mostly from the front row, the usual students. She ignored them. "Mr. Richardson?" Jamal looked up from his notes. A few students turned to watch. She had called on him again, 2 times in the first 20 minutes of class. That wasn't normal. Jamal set his pen down. "It's used in signal processing, engineering models, and differential equations. But in this case, you're using it to simplify an otherwise complex integral." Her jaw tightened. That was right. She nodded stiffly and turned away. Moving on. She didn't acknowledge his answer. Jamal just exhaled and leaned back in his chair. He had seen this before. Professors who expected him to struggle, who pushed him harder than everyone else, waiting for him to slip up. He had spent years navigating these moments, and he knew exactly what this was. He just wasn't going to play into it. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't done. For the next hour, she continued her lesson, peppering the class with questions. Except, more often than not, the questions landed on Jamal. "Mr. Richardson, why don't you walk us through this proof? Mr. Richardson, do you think that's the most efficient method? Mr. Richardson, can you explain why that approach wouldn't work?" By the third time, the pattern was impossible to ignore. A few students exchanged glances, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who had been amused at first started to realize what was happening. Jamal, however, didn't react. He answered each question without hesitation, without a trace of frustration. If anything, he seemed unbothered, and that infuriated her. By the end of class, she was no closer to catching him off guard than when she started. She capped her marker and turned to face the students. "We'll pick up from here next time. Read chapters 4 and 5 before Monday." Chairs scraped against the floor as students gathered their things. A few lingered, whispering to each other. Jamal slid his notebook into his bag and stood. As he reached the door, Dr. Whitmore's voice stopped him. "Mr. Richardson?" He turned. She folded her arms. "You seem prepared. For someone who transferred in late." Jamal met her gaze, unreadable. "I study." A pause. She didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, her tone cool, "let's hope you can keep up." And then she turned away, dismissing him as if the conversation had already ended. Jamal didn't say anything. He just nodded once and walked out. But she wasn't the only one watching. Someone else had noticed. And soon she was going to regret underestimating him. The next class was packed. Word had spread. Dr. Whitmore had singled out Jamal, and he hadn't flinched. Now, students were curious. Was she going to try again? Would he slip up? Or was there something different about him? Jamal walked in as he always did, calm, focused, unbothered. He took his seat, flipping open his notebook while conversations hummed around him. At the front of the room, Dr. Whitmore was already writing on the board. Long, complex expressions stretched across the surface, the kind that made even the brightest students pause. She capped her marker and turned. "All right," she said, scanning the room. "This problem will require everything we've covered so far. It's advanced, time-consuming. Even professionals struggle with it." She paused, then looked directly at Jamal. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice smooth, calculated, "since you seem to enjoy participating, why don't you take a crack at it?" A hush fell over the room. Jamal set his pen down. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his posture, a shift, a quiet readiness. A few students exchanged glances. Some smirked, sensing a trap. Others looked almost uncomfortable. They knew what this was. She wasn't just calling on him. She was setting him up. But Jamal stood, unfazed, and walked to the front. Dr. Whitmore stepped aside, arms crossed, watching. He studied the board for a few seconds. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the marker and started writing, not slowly, not cautiously, with certainty. At first, no one reacted, but then the class started to notice. The way his hand moved, fluid, precise. He wasn't pausing to think. He wasn't second-guessing. He was solving it. The whispers started. "Wait, is he actually... Hold on, I thought this was supposed to be impossible." Jamal kept writing, line after line, reducing, restructuring, eliminating unnecessary steps. The entire room was locked onto him now. Even Dr. Whitmore's expression had shifted, her usual sharp confidence replaced with something else. Minutes passed. Then, without any dramatic flourish, Jamal capped the marker, stepped back, and turned to face the class. The equation was solved. Clean, efficient, beautiful. A heavy silence filled the room. One student muttered under his breath, "No way." Another blinked at the board, processing what had just happened. And Dr. Whitmore? For the first time, she looked caught. She stepped forward, reading through his work, searching for a mistake, an oversight, anything to pick apart. But there was nothing. It was flawless. Jamal didn't say anything. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just stood there, waiting. Dr. Whitmore slowly turned to him. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes told the truth. She had underestimated him. Badly. And worse? The entire class saw it. She cleared her throat. "Well," she said carefully, "that's certainly an unconventional approach, a weak attempt to reclaim control." But someone in the back of the room shifted, then stood. A voice, smooth and authoritative, cut through the air. "I wouldn't call it unconventional." Heads turned. Jamal glanced over and saw a man he didn't recognize. Mid-50s, sharp suit, a presence that commanded attention. The murmurs started again. "Wait, that's Dr. Adler, the MIT professor?" Dr. Whitmore's posture stiffened. She hadn't expected him to speak. Dr. Adler took a few steps forward, looking at the board, then at Jamal. His expression wasn't one of surprise. It was approval. "I'd call it exceptional." And just like that, the entire balance of power in the room shifted. A murmur swept through the room. Dr. Adler wasn't just any professor. His name carried weight. A leading mathematician from MIT known for his contributions to applied calculus and advanced theoretical models. And he was looking at Jamal with something rare. Genuine respect. Jamal kept his expression neutral, but he felt the shift in energy. Dr. Adler stepped closer to the board, studying the solution. He pointed at one section, nodding slightly. "This step here," he said, tapping the equation with his knuckle. "Most would take 3 or 4 extra steps to get there, but you bypassed the unnecessary transformations." Jamal shrugged. Seemed inefficient. Dr. Adler let out a low chuckle. "It was, but I haven't seen many students recognize that, especially not in real time." More whispers. Dr. Whitmore's fingers curled at her sides. She could feel the control slipping from her grasp. "Mr. Richardson," she interjected, her voice tight, "this isn't a competition. We value all approaches in this classroom." Dr. Adler turned to her, his gaze level. "Of course. But let's be honest, Margaret." He gestured at the board. "That's one of the cleanest solutions I've seen from a student in years." Jamal felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Some impressed, some envious, some just shocked. Dr. Whitmore forced a smile. "Yes? Well, one solution doesn't make a mathematician." Dr. Adler raised an eyebrow. "I'd say it's a start." He turned back to Jamal. "Where'd you learn to think like this?" Jamal met his gaze. "My dad," he said simply. "He's an engineer. He taught me when I was a kid, always told me to find the simplest path before I start solving." Dr. Adler nodded. "Smart man." Jamal just gave a small nod in return. Dr. Whitmore was losing ground fast, and she knew it. She needed to regain control, to remind everyone who was in charge. "Well," she said, briskly erasing the board, "this has been an interesting exercise, but let's refocus. We have a lecture to continue." A weak attempt. The students weren't paying attention to her anymore. Dr. Adler wasn't paying attention to her anymore. He was still watching Jamal. And then, casually, like it was nothing, he said, "Have you ever considered applying to MIT?" Silence. Jamal blinked. "What?" Dr. Adler shrugged. "You've got a way of thinking that's rare. We could use minds like yours." The murmurs swelled. Jamal stared at him, unsure how to respond. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward quickly. "Dr. Adler, with all due respect, this is highly irregular." He turned to her unfazed. "So is talent like this." A few students stifled gasps. Jamal kept his face unreadable, but inside something shifted. He had spent years proving himself. Years dealing with people like Dr. Whitmore, people who expected him to fail. But now, standing here, in front of everyone, he was being offered something he hadn't even dared to consider. An opportunity. A real one. Dr. Adler handed him a card. "Think about it," he said simply. "And if you're interested, give me a call." Jamal took the card. It felt heavier than it should have. He nodded once. "I will." Dr. Adler smiled, then turned to leave. But before he did, he glanced back at Dr. Whitmore. "Margaret," he said, voice smooth, almost amused. "Looks like you might have misjudged this one." And then he walked out. The class was never going to see her the same way again, and she knew it. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, her grip tightening around the marker in her hand. The classroom felt different now. Her authority, once unquestioned, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Students were still staring, some at Jamal, others at her. A few exchanged glances, quiet smirks forming. She had spent years commanding respect in this lecture hall. But now, in a matter of minutes, a student she had dismissed, one she had tried to corner, had dismantled that image. Jamal, meanwhile, remained calm. He wasn't gloating, wasn't basking in the moment. He simply returned to his seat, slipping Dr. Adler's card into his pocket without ceremony. Dr. Whitmore cleared her throat. "All right," she said, forcing her usual authoritative tone. "That's enough distractions for today. Back to the material." But no one was listening. The shift had already happened. She spent the rest of the lecture pushing through with equations, but the energy in the room was gone. Students whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. A few sent knowing glances toward Jamal. And he? He just sat there, composed, focused, unbothered. That irritated her more than anything. By the time class ended, she dismissed them with a clipped, "See you next week," before turning swiftly toward her desk. She expected Jamal to leave like the rest of them, but he didn't. He walked toward her desk, waiting until the last student had filtered out before speaking. "Professor?" She glanced up, her face still stiff. "Yes, Mr. Richardson?" He studied her for a moment. Then, in a tone that was calm, too calm, he said, "I know what you were trying to do." Her expression didn't change. "Excuse me?" "You wanted me to fail," he said simply. "You kept pushing, kept waiting for me to slip up, but I didn't." Her jaw tightened. "You're imagining things." Jamal tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" She held his gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt something she wasn't used to in her own classroom. Unease. Jamal exhaled through his nose, then shook his head. "I've dealt with this before, Professor. People expecting me to be less than I am. Acting surprised when I'm not." Her fingers curled slightly against the desk. He slid his bag over his shoulder. "You know what the difference is this time?" She didn't answer. He leaned in slightly, his voice lower. This time, people saw it. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there, still gripping her marker like it was the last thing tethering her to control. For the first time in years, she wasn't the most respected mind in the room, and she hated that more than anything. Dr. Whitmore sat in silence long after the door closed behind Jamal. The classroom, once a space where her word was final, now felt smaller. The truth was, she knew exactly what had happened. She had underestimated him, not just his intelligence, but his resilience. And the worst part? She hadn't just exposed her own biases to him, she had exposed them to everyone. The whispers wouldn't stop. Students talked. Faculty talked. And Dr. Adler? He had made sure she knew just how wrong she had been. That night, she sat in her office, fingers hovering over her keyboard. She wanted to type something, an email, an excuse, an attempt to reframe the situation. But there was nothing to say, no way to spin it. She had been wrong. And worse, she had been predictable. Meanwhile, Jamal sat in his dorm room staring at Dr. Adler's card. He flipped it between his fingers, still processing everything that had happened. He had walked into that classroom expecting to be challenged. He had dealt with people like Dr. Whitmore before. But this time had been different. This time, he hadn't just proved himself. He had been seen. He pulled out his phone and dialed. A voice picked up almost immediately. Dr. Adler speaking. Jamal hesitated for only a second. Then, with the same quiet confidence he had carried through the entire ordeal, he said, "I'd like to talk about MIT." A small chuckle on the other end. "I was hoping you'd say that." As Jamal leaned back in his chair, a thought settled in his mind, one that had taken years to truly believe. His talent spoke for itself, and no one, not even people like Dr. Whitmore, could take that away. Because no matter how much someone tries to diminish you, the truth has a way of coming to light. And when it does, the only thing left to do is shine. If you've ever felt underestimated, doubted, or pushed aside, remember, your talent is yours. No one can take it from you. Keep pushing. Keep proving them wrong. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more.